Somewhere in Brazil, your neighbor knocked on a door, handed over a few coins, and walked home with a warm pastry, never knowing what was inside it, never knowing that someone's daughter had become the filling. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. This story was put together through hours of careful research and attention to detail. Every part was thoughtfully crafted to create an immersive experience while approaching these real events with the seriousness and respect they deserve. The purpose of this channel is to keep these stories alive so they are not forgotten with time. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Garanhuns cannibals, aka O Cartel, the flesh cartel of Pernambuco. Now let's begin. There is a kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not wear a mask or lurk in shadow. It opens a door with a smile. It offers you a job, a home, a warm bed, a future. It speaks gently to desperate people, to hungry people, to people whose lives have left them with no other options. And when those people walk through the door, it closes behind them forever. The case of the Garanhuns cannibals is not simply a story about murder. It is not simply a story about cannibalism, though both happened with a frequency that should disturb every reasonable person alive. It is a story about a man who believed he had been chosen by heaven to cleanse the earth of what he called evil. A man who wrote his plans down in a book, who built a religion around his hunger, who took a wife, then a mistress, and turned both women into instruments of slaughter. It is the story of a household that functioned as a killing floor, a butcher shop, and a street food stall all at once. It is the story of Brazil's most disturbing trio. 3 people who murdered, dismembered, cooked, consumed, and sold human beings, and the only reason the world found out was because a 5-year-old girl showed the police where the bodies were buried. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. At the center of what happened in Garanhuns was one man. Remove him from the story, and the entire structure collapses. The manuscript, the theology, the doctrine he slowly built and preached to 2 women who became completely devoted to him, all of it began with him. The killings that followed were not random acts of violence. They were organized, ritualistic, and driven by something far more disturbing than rage alone: belief. A carefully cultivated conviction that their actions served a higher purpose, that what they were doing was justified, necessary, even approved by heaven. His name was Jorge Beltrao Negromonte de Silveira. He was born on December 14, 1961, to Portuguese immigrants living in Brazil. From early in his life, the signs were there, though no one acted on them with the seriousness the situation demanded. As a young man, he was connected to the death of a 17-year-old named Luciano Severino da Silva. He was charged with murder. The case went to court, and he walked free, acquitted for lack of evidence. That acquittal may be one of the most consequential failures of the Brazilian justice system in the modern era, because Jorge Negromonte did not stop. He did not reflect. He did not quietly disappear into an ordinary life. Instead, he disappeared into his own mind, and what he found there was something monstrous. At some point in his adult life, Jorge began experiencing what he described as visions. He claimed to hear voices. He claimed to receive instructions from divine sources. An angel and a cherub, he said, who communicated with him and gave him a mission. The mission, as he understood and later documented it in extensive handwritten detail, was the purification of the world. The earth was overpopulated, he believed. It was filled with evil people, people who carried negative spiritual energy, who polluted the world simply by existing. And it was his responsibility, his divine assignment, to reduce that population, to cleanse what he saw as the corruption of humanity. The method he prescribed was not a bomb or a plague. It was something far more intimate. It was murder, and it was consumption. Jorge eventually compiled his beliefs into a manuscript. He titled it Revelations of a Schizophrenic, a self-published, 34-chapter document in which he laid out with startling clarity exactly what he believed, what he intended, and what he had done. The book described killings. It described rituals involving blood and flesh. It described his connection to supernatural voices that urged him forward. For years, no one read it. No one acted on it. It sat in existence as open evidence of what this man was, and the world went about its business without noticing. Jorge was not alone in his beliefs. He had a wife, a woman named Isabel Cristina Torrio Perez de Silveira, and the two had been together for years. Isabel was not an unwilling participant dragged into something she did not choose. Over time, the evidence would show that she was deeply involved, that she understood the ideology, and that she participated actively in what the group did. But Jorge's inner circle expanded further. At some point, he met a young woman named Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva. Bruna was born on September 29, 1986, in natal Rio Grande do Norte. She was significantly younger than Jorge, and by the time she entered his life, she was a teenager. She had met him at a gym where he practiced martial arts and where he apparently instructed students. Despite his marriage, despite the age gap, a relationship developed. And before long, Bruna moved in with Jorge and Isabel, forming a living arrangement that was, by any conventional measure, deeply unusual. A husband, his wife, and his live-in mistress, all under one roof, all bound together by a shared doctrine that Jorge had authored and enforced. Together, the three of them called themselves O Cartel, the cartel. It was their sect, their secret society, their spiritual unit. Jorge was the leader, the prophet, the one who claimed divine authority. Isabel and Bruna were his disciples, his partners, his accomplices. And within the framework of their shared belief system, they constructed a theology of killing that gave each murder a sacred justification. The doctrine held that in order to complete their purification mission, the group needed to kill a specific number of victims, 4, corresponding to the 4 natural elements: air, earth, water, and fire. Each death was a ritual. The flesh of the victim was to be consumed as part of the process, as an act of spiritual incorporation, a way of cleansing the world of the negative energy that person carried. Jorge claimed that once all 4 killings were completed, a portal to paradise would open, a gateway through which he and his companions could ascend to a higher plane of existence. It sounds like madness because it is madness, but it was madness with structure, with steps, with a clear procedure that the trio followed with grim consistency. The crimes began in the city of Olinda, just north of Recife, the state capital of Pernambuco. In the beginning, Bruna kept a diary. The diary covered the period from March to July of 2007, and it provides an extraordinary and chilling window into the mechanics of how the group operated, specifically, how they selected and approached their victims. Because the cartel did not hunt in the conventional sense. They did not stalk women through dark streets or break into homes. Their method was far more psychological, and in some ways far more disturbing, because it exploited the very desperation that poverty creates. They looked for vulnerable women, women who had nothing, women who were homeless, who were struggling, who were hungry, who had children to feed and no stable means of doing it. Women who would say yes to a job offer from a stranger because they had no other option. Bruna's diary described this process in clinical detail. She wrote about how the group identified and then gradually cultivated their targets, giving them gifts, offering them kindness, showing them warmth and attention. She used the word conquered to describe the process. They conquered their victims emotionally before they ever laid a hand on them physically. They made the women feel safe, wanted, cared for, and then they invited them inside. On May 26, 2008, the cartel found their first confirmed victim. Her name was Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira. She was 17 years old. She was homeless and living on the streets of Olinda with her 1-year-old daughter, a baby she had been carrying through poverty and instability since early in her young life. By every account, Jessica had experienced a difficult existence. She was the kind of person the world had already failed. Young, without resources, without a safety net, without anyone powerful enough to protect her. When Jorge and Isabel approached her, offering her a job in their home, offering her and her baby a place to stay, she had every reason to say yes and very little reason to say no. She said yes. She was brought to their house in Olinda. She was allowed to settle in. Her daughter was with her. And then, when the moment the cartel had been building toward finally arrived, it came with sudden and savage violence. Jessica was struck on the head. She was dragged into the bathroom, and there her jugular vein was cut. She bled out in the bathroom of the house that had been presented to her as a sanctuary. What happened next crossed from the realm of murder into something that the human mind instinctively resists processing. The trio dismembered her body. They consumed portions of her flesh. This was not an act of desperation or survival. It was deliberate, pre-planned, and ideologically motivated. It was part of the ritual, the purification, the sacred process that Jorge had prescribed and that his two companions had accepted as doctrine. But Jessica's daughter was still alive. The 1-year-old baby, who had accompanied her mother into that house, was now without a mother. The cartel made a decision about the child that, in a strange and terrible way, speaks to the complexity of the evil at work in that household. They did not harm her. They kept her. They raised her as their own, incorporating her into their family unit, caring for her in the ordinary daily sense while conducting rituals of cannibalism within the same walls. Jorge later told police that the girl was his daughter with Jessica, a claim that may have been a lie designed to create a legal bond, or may have contained some truth about the nature of his relationship with the young victim. Either way, the child grew up inside the cartel's household, and what she witnessed and experienced during those years would eventually become the key that unlocked the entire case. One detail about Jessica's death that has never been fully resolved is how many people knew she was missing. She was homeless. She was young. She had no stable family structure watching out for her. The kind of disappearance that makes the front page when it happens to someone with connections and visibility went largely unnoticed when it happened to her. She vanished from the streets of Olinda, and the world moved on. After the 2008 killing, the cartel moved. This is a pattern with the group. Movement, relocation, constant geographic shifting that helped them evade attention and start fresh in new communities where no one knew their history. They moved through several locations. The city of Condé in Paraíba, then back into Pernambuco, passing through Jaboado dos Guararapes and then Gravata. They took Jessica's daughter with them everywhere they went. They continued to live as a unit, presenting themselves to neighbors as an unconventional but unremarkable household. A man, his wife, his second companion, and a small child. And for almost 4 years after Jessica's death, the killing stopped. Or at least, the killing that has been officially confirmed stopped. Jorge would later suggest, during interrogations, that the actual number of victims was considerably higher than 3, somewhere between 3 and more than 10 by his own accounting. Investigators suspected involvement in at least 5 additional deaths across Pernambuco and neighboring Paraíba, and police publicly stated their belief that the trio had killed 4 other women in the state of Pernambuco and 1 in Paraíba, all of whom they believed suffered the same fate as the confirmed victims. But bodies are difficult to find when the people who buried them have had years to cover their tracks, and the full scope of the cartel's crimes has never been definitively established. What is known is that by early 2012, the trio had settled in the Jardim Petropolis neighborhood in Garanhuns, a city of approximately 111,000 people in the interior of Pernambuco, a place notable for its unusually mild climate in an otherwise hot region, sometimes called the Switzerland of Pernambuco or the City of Flowers. It is a quiet, modest place, a place where people buy pastries from street vendors without question, a place where a family could blend in, set up a household, and go largely unnoticed. And it was there, in the spring of 2012, that the cartel resumed what they had started. The 4-year pause, whatever its cause, was over. By the time the cartel settled into the Jardim Petropolis neighborhood of Garanhuns in early 2012, they had refined everything. The belief system had been in place for years. The method had been used before. The three of them understood their roles without needing to discuss them at length. Jorge was the organizer, the theologian, the one who identified targets and directed the group's actions. Isabel had been with him longest and carried the steady, practiced composure of someone who had normalized the abnormal through years of daily proximity to it. Bruna, who was in her mid-20s by this point, had entered the group as a teenager and had grown up inside its ideology. What might have repelled another person had become, for her, simply the way things were. The pattern they used to find victims had not changed. They looked for women in need. Women who were struggling financially, who had few connections, few people to notice or report their absence. Women who could be approached with the offer of a job, specifically a nanny position. It was a logical choice of bait. Domestic work was common, informal, and rarely contracted in a way that created official records. A woman offered a nanny job by a seemingly ordinary household had no particular reason for suspicion. She would go to meet the family. She would go to the house. She would not come back, and depending on how isolated she was, it might be weeks or months before anyone noticed she was gone. In February 2012, they found Gisele Helena da Silva. She was 31 years old. She had heard about a nanny position available in Garanhuns and had made the journey to inquire about it. She was a real person with a family who loved her. A family who would eventually report her missing, who would push for answers when none came, who would refuse to accept the silence that the cartel was counting on. But Gisele did not know any of that when she walked up to the house in Jardine Petropolis. She knew only that she needed work and that someone had offered it. The details of exactly what happened inside that house were revealed partly through police investigation and partly through the eventual confessions of the perpetrators themselves. What is known is that Gisele was killed. What is known is that she was dismembered, that her body was taken apart with a deliberateness that reflected practice. Portions of her flesh, reportedly from the thighs and buttocks, were removed. Her remains were buried in the backyard of the house, in a makeshift grave that would not be discovered for weeks. And the flesh that had been removed from her body was used. It was used to make food. This is the part of the Garanhuns case that caused the initial shock to ripple so far beyond the borders of Pernambuco, beyond Brazil, across news networks and online forums and true crime communities worldwide. Because the cartel was not simply consuming their victims in private, as part of a closed ritual. They were processing the flesh, mixing it into the recipes of popular Brazilian street foods, pastries, empanadas, coxinhas, the thick savory pies known as empadas, and selling them to neighbors, to people who passed by, to customers who had no idea what they were eating. The coxinha is a beloved Brazilian snack. It is a teardrop-shaped croquette, typically filled with seasoned shredded chicken, coated in dough and breadcrumbs, fried until golden. It is comfort food. It is the kind of thing you buy from a street vendor or a home cook in a neighborhood and eat without thought. Isabel had reportedly been making and selling baked goods as a source of income for some time. It was a modest way of bringing money into the household given Jorge's inability to work due to his mental condition. What the neighbors who bought from her almost certainly did not know was that among the ingredients in some of her savory pastries was human flesh. The flesh of women who had come to the house looking for work. Investigators would later note that the trio sold these items to locals in the neighborhood, and reports suggested that the food was also taken to schools and hospitals in the area. The full scope of how many people may have unknowingly consumed human remains through these transactions was never precisely determined, and the possibility that the answer to that question is more than a handful haunted the investigation and the community for years afterward. 17 days after Gisele disappeared, the cartel struck again. On March 15, 2012, a 20-year-old woman named Alexandra da Silva Falcao was lured to the house under the same pretense. She was young, she was looking for work, and she had no reason to distrust the people who invited her in. What happened to her in that house is among the most disturbing moments of a disturbing case. While Alexandra was inside, speaking with one of the women of the trio, likely to put her at ease, to keep her calm and unsuspecting, Jorge came at her from behind. He moved fast and without warning. He drove a knife into her neck. Alexandra da Silva Falcao died in a house she had entered hoping for a job. She was dismembered. Her flesh was used in the same way Giselle's had been processed, seasoned, incorporated into savory pastries that were then sold in the neighborhood. 2 women, both murdered within weeks of each other, both reduced, in the ideology of the cartel, to raw material for a ritual that Jorge had decided was divinely mandated. Both sold in fragments to people who would go home, eat their purchase, and feel satisfied. Throughout all of this, Jessica's daughter was in the house. She was now 5 years old. She had spent her entire conscious life in this household, in the care of the people who had killed her mother. The things she had seen in that house, the violence, the blood, the bodies, were not extraordinary to her because she had no other frame of reference. She had grown up with them as her normal. She called Jorge her father. She lived among murderers and cannibals and called it home. It is deeply uncomfortable to consider what that child's daily existence looked like. Later accounts would confirm that she was made to eat food prepared from the flesh of the victims. Whether she was told what she was consuming is not definitively established, but the deliberate nature of the cartel's actions suggests that the boundary between the child and their crimes was not something the trio felt compelled to maintain. She was part of the household. The household was a killing operation. The two things existed without separation. Bruna had written about the group's methods years earlier in her diary, and her writing reflects the psychological world the cartel inhabited. A world in which what they were doing was not murder but purification, in which their victims were not innocent people but carriers of negative spiritual energy who had been selected for removal by a higher power. She wrote about Jorge with reverence. She described his teachings as harsh but necessary. She positioned herself as a student, an eternal learner, shaped and improved by his guidance. The extent to which this was genuine belief versus the internalized language of a woman under the psychological control of a dominating figure is difficult to determine from the outside. Both things may have been true simultaneously. What is certain is that by March 2012, the cartel had committed at least 3 murders that investigators could document. And Jorge's own admissions suggested the real number was substantially higher. The group had been operating across multiple cities and states for years. They had moved repeatedly, always staying one step ahead of whatever vague awareness might have been building around them. They had a child in their care. They had a food business that provided modest income and a method of disposing of evidence. They had a belief system that told them everything they were doing was correct and sacred and approved by forces beyond the earthly realm. And they had a book, Jorge's manuscript, that documented it in careful, explicit detail. By April 2012, they were still in Garrahan's. They were still selling pastries. And they had made an error, the kind of small, careless error that unravels everything. Giselle Helena da Silva had a family, and her family had been waiting for her to come home. When she disappeared in February, the people who loved her did not simply accept it. They reported her missing. They pressed the police for investigation. And in the weeks that followed her disappearance, something strange began happening with her bank account. Her credit card was being used. Purchases were being made in her name in Garrahan's, at stores for everyday items, by people who were using her financial identity as casually as if it were their own. Her family flagged the transactions. Investigators began looking at the records. The purchases led to stores. The stores had security cameras. And the security cameras had captured the faces of the people making those purchases. The faces belonged to Jorge Beltrao Negromonte de Silveira, Isabel Cristina Torrio Pires de Silveira, and Bruna Cristina Oliveira de Silva. Arrest warrants were issued on April 9, 2012. Police moved on the house in Jardim Petropolis. The door opened, and what they found inside and in the backyard of that modest, ordinary-looking home would confirm every worst suspicion and exceed nearly every investigator's expectation of what the case actually involved. The house in Jardim Petropolis looked like countless other modest homes in the neighborhood. It sat unremarkably on its street. Neighbors had bought food from the woman who lived there. Children had played nearby. Nothing about the exterior suggested what the interior contained, or what had been done within those walls, or what was buried in the earth just beyond the back door. But on April 9, 2012, when Brazilian police arrived with warrants and the weight of a building investigation behind them, the the house stopped being ordinary within minutes of their arrival. The three members of the cartel, Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna, were taken into custody. At the time of the arrest, Jessica's daughter was still in the house. She was 5 years old, bright-eyed, and carrying inside her small mind a knowledge of things that most adults will spend their entire lives never witnessing. The police took her into protective custody, and almost immediately, she began to talk. What she told investigators reshaped the entire investigation and sent it in directions that confirmed the worst of what police had begun to suspect. She told them that her father, the man she had been raised to call her father, the man she had watched and lived with and depended on, had killed women. She described it. She described where the bodies had been put. She pointed, in the way that small children point when they are showing you something they have accepted as fact, toward the backyard. Investigators brought equipment. They began to dig. They found them. Beneath the soil of the backyard, in makeshift graves that had been dug with practical intention, they found the buried remains of at least 2 women. The bones were dismembered, consistent with the deliberate and practiced process that the confessions would later describe. The physical evidence told its story clearly. These were not accidental deaths, not spontaneous acts of passion, but planned, methodical killings followed by the systematic processing of the bodies. Bloodstains were found in the bathroom drain. A wooden mallet, apparently blood-stained, was recovered. Torn clothing, physical traces of violence embedded in the surfaces of a home that had gone on presenting itself as a domestic space throughout the entire time the murders were being committed within it. The confessions began. Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna, once in custody and confronted with the physical evidence and the testimony of the child, moved into different postures of admission and deflection at different points in the interrogation process. But the central facts of the case were not meaningfully disputed for long, because the evidence was overwhelming and because the child's account had been given with the particular, unadorned credibility that children carry when they describe things they have genuinely seen. Jorge's confessions were the most expansive and the most disturbing. He acknowledged the killings. He acknowledged the cannibalism. He acknowledged the sale of the meat in pastry form to unsuspecting neighbors. And he went further, suggesting in some statements that the number of victims extended well beyond the 3 that investigators had confirmed. That the cartel had killed not just Jessica, Giselle, and Alexandra, but potentially a significantly larger number of women across the years of their operation. He suggested possible counts of anywhere from 3 to more than 10 people. Brazilian authorities confirmed their suspicion that 5 additional murders may have been committed, 4 in Pernambuco and 1 in Paraíba, and stated publicly that they believed those additional victims had suffered the same fate as the confirmed 3. But recovering evidence for those suspected killings proved enormously difficult given the time elapsed, the number of relocations the group had made, and the nature of the disposal methods involved. The book also emerged. Revelations of a Schizophrenic, Jorge's manuscript, the 34-chapter document he had written and self-published, was recovered in the house. Investigators read it. What they found was not fiction, not the confused fantasy of a mind playing creative games, but a documentary account of beliefs and actions that directly corresponded to what the physical evidence was showing them. Jorge had written down what he intended to do and what he had done. He had written about the killings, the rituals, the consumption of flesh, the divine voices that instructed him. He had written it all out and then continued living among ordinary people who had no idea the book existed. It became both evidence and exhibit, a window into a psychology that had been visible in writing for years before anyone thought to look through it. Isabel's confession revealed the particular horror of her own specific actions. She was not a woman who had been coerced into the periphery of violence and kept her hands clean. She was present for the killings. She participated in the dismemberments, and in one of the most deeply disturbing details of the entire case. A detail that, once encountered, is extraordinarily difficult to set aside. She was the one who prepared the food. She took the flesh of Giselle Helena da Silva and Alexandra da Silva Falcao, processed it, seasoned it, incorporated it into the dough of the pastries that she then packaged and sold. She carried those pastries out of the house where the murders had taken place and exchanged them for money with people who had absolutely no idea what they were consuming. She did this with the composure of someone running an ordinary small business. She did this repeatedly. Bruna's version of events introduced a note of legal and strategic complexity that played out over the subsequent trial proceedings. She acknowledged being present, acknowledged knowledge of what the group was doing, but attempted at various points to frame her own involvement as something shaped by coercion, that she had complied because she feared what would happen to her if she did not. She used the word "coxinia" in a chilling way during questioning, suggesting that she had been told that if she did not comply, she would be turned into one. Whether this reflected genuine fear, a legal strategy, or some combination of both, it demonstrated that even within the cartel itself, the boundaries of power and coercion were not uniform. Jorge exercised a level of psychological authority over both women that investigators, psychologists, and the courts would spend years attempting to fully assess. The neighborhood's reaction when the news broke was immediate and visceral. People who had bought food from the woman in the house on that street processed, in real time, the realization of what they had almost certainly eaten. The community's response was not measured. Locals set fire to the house. They burned it. The building that had served as both home and abattoir was destroyed by people whose sense of violation and revulsion could not be contained in any more restrained expression. The fire did not impede the investigation significantly. Investigators had already extracted the evidence they needed, but it spoke with terrifying clarity to the emotional shockwave that the case sent through the community and through Brazil as a whole. Among the items recovered before the fire took hold was Bruna's diary, the journal she had kept in 2007 that documented the early days of the group's activities and the cultivation of their first victim. The diary had survived years, multiple relocations, and the indifference of a group that apparently felt no need to destroy it. Its survival was one of the more remarkable aspects of the evidentiary picture. Corroborated the timeline, corroborated the method. It put in Bruna's own handwriting the confirmation that the targeting of vulnerable women had been deliberate, systematic, and understood by all three members of the group as the group's operational method. The investigation also began piecing together the story of Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira, the first victim, the 17-year-old whose murder in 2008 had set everything in motion and who had been forgotten by the formal attention of authorities for years because her disappearance had created no paper trail substantial enough to pursue. Her daughter, now in protective custody, became in a strange and painful irony the primary witness to the first crime. A child who had never known her mother, who had spent her formative years in the care of her mother's killers, and who now carried the weight of being the person whose words had finally brought the investigation to its breaking point. The girl's testimony was not the testimony of a traumatized child struggling to articulate what she had seen. It was clear. It was direct. She described locations. She described events. She had grown up watching and living alongside this reality and had internalized it in a way that made her, at 5 years old, a more precise witness than anyone could have anticipated. She told investigators where the bodies were, and the investigators found them exactly where she said they would be. In the aftermath of the arrests, as Brazilian media descended on the case and the story spread internationally, the question that circulated most persistently was one that had no clean answer. How had this continued for so long? How had 3 people been committing murders and selling the processed flesh of their victims as street food in a city of 111,000 people without being caught? How had Jorge's manuscript existed in the world without triggering an investigation? How had the disappearances of multiple women across multiple cities in Pernambuco and Paraíba not connected into a visible pattern that law enforcement could act on? The answer, uncomfortable and multi-layered, had everything to do with who the victims were. Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira was a homeless teenager. She was 17 years old. She had a baby. She was living on the streets. When she disappeared, there was no one with institutional power advocating for her case. There was no one generating the kind of sustained public pressure that forces investigations forward. She was exactly the kind of person who could disappear from the world without leaving the kind of noise that demands to be answered. Gisele and Alexandra, who disappeared in 2012, were different only in that Gisele's family had the presence of mind to push, to report, to pursue, to keep asking questions, to notice the credit card activity that became the thread that ultimately unraveled everything. If Gisele's family had accepted her disappearance with the same institutional indifference that Jessica's disappearance had received, the cartel might have continued operating for years longer. The credit card was careless. The use of a murdered woman's financial instruments in the city where she had been killed, at shops with surveillance cameras, was a mistake so fundamental that it raises questions about whether the group had begun to feel entirely untouchable. Whether years of operating without consequence had eroded whatever caution they once possessed. It was not a brilliant piece of detective work that caught them. It was their own arrogance, their own sense of immunity, and it cost them everything. The Brazilian justice system moved on the Garanhuns case across multiple proceedings, because the murders had been committed in different locations and therefore fell under different jurisdictional courts. This created a process that was extended, technical, and, for the families of the victims and for a public that had been shaken to its core, agonizingly slow. But the outcomes, when they finally arrived, reflected both the weight of the evidence and the Brazilian legal system's recognition that what had happened in those houses in Olinda and Garanhuns was among the most severe offenses the law could be asked to process. The first trial addressed the 2008 murder of Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira. This was the case that had gone longest without official attention. The 17-year-old homeless girl whose disappearance had registered almost no institutional concern at the time. Now, in a formal courtroom, the full account of what had been done to her was laid out in testimony and evidence, and the three people who had done it sat and listened as the case against them was constructed from their own confessions, from Bruna's diary, from Jorge's manuscript, from the physical evidence recovered at their various homes, and from the account of the 5-year-old girl who had been living with her mother's killers. The jury trial was held in Olinda, the city where Jessica had been killed and where the first murder had been committed. In November 2014, the verdicts were returned. All three, Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna, were found guilty of the murder of Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira. The sentences were substantial. The second set of trials, addressing the 2012 murders of Gisele Helena da Silva and Alexandra da Silva Falcao, produced additional convictions in 2018. The sentences were added together under Brazilian law, resulting in final cumulative imprisonment terms that reflected the scale of what each individual had been found responsible for. Jorge Negromonte and Isabel Pires each received sentences of 92 years. Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva received 95 years. All three were imprisoned, and as of the time of this account, they remain incarcerated. The sentencing numbers are, in practical terms, largely symbolic. No person serves 92 years in prison, but they carry a different kind of meaning in the architecture of a case like this. They are the law's declaration of magnitude. They say, this was not a single act of violence to be measured and punished and moved past. This was a sustained, deliberate, ideologically motivated campaign of murder and desecration that destroyed human beings, that violated their families, that poisoned a community's relationship with the most ordinary and intimate aspects of daily life, food, trust, neighborly commerce, and that will require a reckoning commensurate with what it actually was. For the families of Gisele and Alexandra, the convictions represented a form of justice, however incomplete. Gisele's family, the people whose persistence in pursuing the credit card irregularities had ultimately cracked the case open, had been carrying the weight of her loss since February 2012. They had refused to accept silence. They had pushed and asked and kept pushing even when the apparatus of official response was slow to mobilize. Their refusal to let their daughter and sister disappear without consequence was, in the most literal possible sense, what ended the cartel's operation. For the family of Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira, the situation was substantially more complicated. Jessica had been dead for 4 years before anyone in an official capacity fully grasped what had happened to her. Her daughter, the child who had lived inside the cartel's household, who had eaten food prepared from the flesh of victims, who had been registered under Jorge's name on legal documents as though he were her father, emerged from the case in a position that no legal framework had been specifically designed to address. That child, now growing up under circumstances that can only be described as among the most extraordinary and devastating in recent Brazilian history, later sought legal action to have Jorge Negromonte's name removed from her birth certificate. She had been made, without her consent or understanding, a legal member of the household of the man who had murdered her mother. The work of separating herself from that identity, of reclaiming even the formal legal record of her own existence as something untouched by Jorge, became one of the many pieces of unfinished business that the Garanhuns case left in its wake. Jorge's manuscript, Revelations of a Schizophrenic, drew a particular type of extended scrutiny from psychologists, criminologists, and journalists in the years following the trial. The book was remarkable not because it was sophisticated or philosophically coherent, it was neither, but because of what it demonstrated about the gap between the detection of expressed violent ideation and the prevention of the violence that follows from it. Jorge had written down, in explicit terms, what he believed and what he intended to do. He had self-published it. It had existed as a document in the world for years, and no mechanism had caught it, evaluated it, or acted on it in time to prevent a single death. The manuscript became, in the criminological literature on the case, a case study in the failure of preemptive intervention. In the way that openly expressed dangerous ideology, when it comes from a person without social prominence or institutional visibility, can exist entirely in plain view without generating the response it deserves. The theological dimension of the case occupied a significant amount of the post-trial discussion. Jorge's claim that he received instructions from an angel and a cherub, that a divine voice had assigned him the task of reducing the world's population through ritual murder and cannibalism, raised serious questions about the relationship between his belief system and his mental state. He had been hospitalized in a psychiatric facility at one point earlier in his life, and the title of his manuscript directly invoked schizophrenia as an organizing concept. Brazilian courts addressed this dimension during the proceedings. The question of whether Jorge was legally responsible for his actions given his apparent psychiatric history and the nature of his stated beliefs was central to the defense arguments. The courts determined that Jorge was criminally responsible. The presence of a coherent, documented, systematically applied ideology, one that he had constructed, written down, articulated to others, and operationalized with consistency over years, worked against any argument that his actions were the product of a disorganized or uncontrolled mind. Whatever Jorge's psychiatric diagnosis, he had planned. He had recruited. He had moved the group across cities when circumstances required it. He had used a specific method of victim selection consistently. He had maintained a domestic life and a food business that served as cover. These were not the actions of someone unable to distinguish action from consequence, planning from execution. They were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway, framing it within a belief system that provided the justification he needed to keep going. Isabel Cristina Torrio Perez presents a different kind of puzzle. She was Jorge's wife. She had been with him longest. She had watched him develop and articulate the theology of the cartel over years. She had participated in the killings and dismemberments. She had prepared and sold the food. She was not, by any reasonable assessment, a passive bystander. But the nature of her motivation, whether it was belief, love, fear, dependency, or some combination of all four, was never cleanly resolved by the trial proceedings. She was convicted. She was sentenced. But the psychological accounting of how a woman arrives at the place where she stands in a bathroom carving a dead woman's flesh for inclusion in pastries she will sell to her neighbors remains, in the absence of any fully reliable interior account from Isabel herself, something that defies comfortable explanation. Bruna's case generated the most public sympathy, to the extent that any member of the cartel was capable of generating it, which was very little. She was the youngest. She had been recruited as a teenager. She had entered Jorge's orbit at a point in her development when his authority and his ideology would have had maximum formative power. Her diary entries, which read in places as the writing of a young woman genuinely shaped by someone she admired and feared in roughly equal measure, suggested a degree of psychological capture that complicated the straightforward narrative of three equally culpable perpetrators acting in perfect ideological alignment. But Brazilian courts ultimately did not find this sufficient mitigation for the acts she had committed. She received the longest sentence of the three. The house in Jardim Petrópolis, as noted, had been burned by community members in the immediate aftermath of the arrests. The location became, in the local consciousness of Garanhuns, a site of collective trauma, a place that the city had to continue occupying in geographic terms while trying to process what had happened there. People who had bought pastries from Isabel, who had handed over coins and received what they thought was a snack and gone about their days, lived with the knowledge of what they had done in innocence for the rest of their lives. There is no legal mechanism for that particular form of harm, no court proceeding that addresses it. It is simply a thing those people carry quietly, indefinitely. The Garanhuns cannibals case was not the last time Brazil would confront something of this nature, and it was not the first. But it occupies a specific place in the national consciousness and in the global true crime archive because of the particular combination of elements it contained. The domestic setting, the food, the child, the theology, the manuscript, the years of undetected operation, the victims chosen precisely because their disappearance would generate the least official response. Each of those elements on its own is disturbing. Together, they form something that functions almost as a systematic critique of the social structures that failed to prevent it. The vulnerable are easy to disappear. The isolated and the poor and the desperate are not watched over by the machinery of official attention in the same way that others are. The cartel understood this, whether they articulated it in those terms or not. Their method of victim selection was a predatory map of social invisibility. And for years it worked perfectly, until a family checked a credit card statement, until a 5-year-old showed a police officer where to dig, until the small, careless evidence of continued existence, a debit transaction in the city where a woman had gone missing, created the thread that ran all the way back to a house where 2 dismembered bodies were buried in the yard and a man's 34-chapter manuscript sat on a shelf, waiting for someone to finally read it. Jorge Beltrao Negromonte de Silveira, Isabel Cristina Torrio Pires de Silveira, and Bruna Cristina Oliveira de Silva are in prison. They are serving combined sentences that will, mathematically, outlast their natural lives. The cartel, as they called themselves, is finished. The portal to paradise that Jorge promised them, the spiritual ascension that was supposed to follow the completion of their ritual killings. None of it came. There was no angel. There was no cherub. There was no divine voice that had selected them for a sacred mission. There was only a man who had constructed a theology that made his cruelty feel righteous. 2 women he drew into that theology with varying degrees of coercion and consent, and the women they killed. Women whose only error was trusting people who offered them something they needed. Jessica Camila de Silva Pereira was 17. She had a baby. She needed a home and a job, and she trusted the people who offered both. She deserved better from the world that failed her. Not just in the moment she walked through that door, but in every moment before it that left her without options, without protection, without anyone powerful enough to stand between her and the people who would take her life before she turned 18. That is where this story ends. Not with the prison sentences or the burned house or the legal proceedings. It ends with a 17-year-old girl who was hungry and exhausted and hoping for something better, who met the worst people in the world while looking for help, and who has never received the justice or the remembrance that the scale of what was done to her demands. Her name was Jessica. Remember it. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. He hunted lovers in the dark, the beast of Brazil's most beautiful beach. This is the story of Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva, aka Titicaca, the casino maniac, the fisherman who fished for blood. They drove to the beach to feel alive, and he was already waiting in the dark to make sure they never left. Picture this. A summer night so perfect it almost feels rehearsed. The kind of night where the ocean air sits warm on your skin, where the sound of waves rolling in feels like a lullaby written specifically for two people in love. The windows of the car fog up slowly. The world outside disappears. They are alone, or so they believe, but crouched somewhere in the thick coastal darkness, breathing slow, watching, calculating. A man with dead eyes and a loaded weapon has already chosen them. He has been watching for a while now. He knows the car. He knows the spot. He has done this before. And the terrifying truth, the detail that will stay with you long after this video ends, is that after he finishes, after the last gunshot fractures the night air and silence swallows everything whole, he does not run. He walks calmly toward the arriving police and bystanders. He listens to them discover the bodies. He watches their horror with steady, curious eyes. He is not afraid. He is entertained. His name is Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva. They called him Titicaca. They called him the Casino Maniac. And by the time Brazil understood what was lurking along the shores of Praia do Cassino, 7 people were already dead, and 1 broken young girl had survived only by convincing a monster that she was a corpse. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to fishing towns, a quiet built from salt wind, long hours, and the rhythm of the sea. Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state of Brazil, carries that silence well. It is a place of sweeping coastlines and modest communities, where families know each other's names and fishermen leave before dawn without a second thought. It is also the place where Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva was born in 1971, a child who would one day become the most feared predator the state had ever produced. To understand how something like Paulo Sergio happens, you have to resist the urge to look for the obvious monster from the beginning. The truth is far more unsettling. Monsters do not announce themselves. They live quietly among the ordinary. They go unnoticed for years, decades, sometimes, carrying whatever darkness lives inside them in silence, wearing the unremarkable face of a neighbor, a worker, a man you might pass on the street and forget by afternoon. Paulo Sergio grew up in the coastal region of Rio Grande do Sul, a child of the southern Brazilian working class. He became a fisherman, a trade that requires patience, solitude, and the ability to wait without moving for long stretches of time. These are qualities that serve well out on the water. They serve differently in a man who has decided to hunt human beings. The patience of a fisherman, the stillness, the silence, the quiet observation of prey, translated into something hideous when applied to the way Paulo Sergio would later stalk his victims. His criminal history did not begin with murder. Before the world knew his name in the worst possible way, Paulo Sergio had already given the justice system a preview. He was imprisoned on an attempted murder charge. A fact so significant in hindsight that it makes the blood run cold, because what followed his release from prison would confirm every fear that should have been attached to his name from the moment that first crime was committed. He spent 9 years inside the Rio Grande State Penitentiary. 9 years behind walls. 9 years that should have, by any reasonable expectation, reshaped or at the very minimum contained whatever it was that drove him to violence. They did not. If anything, those 9 years appear to have done something far more dangerous than rehabilitate him. They gave him time to think, time to observe, time to absorb the stories of other killers that circulated through prison culture like dark folklore, their names spoken with a reverence that turned crime into competition. It was inside those walls, or through the information that seeped in from the outside world, that Paulo Sergio encountered the name of Francisco de Assis Pereira. A man the press had branded the park maniac. Pereira had stalked and murdered women in Sao Paulo in 1998, a spree that sent a shockwave through Brazil and plastered his name across every front page in the country. He had become, in the twisted calculus of criminal infamy, famous. And Paulo Sergio, listening, absorbing, forming something dark and deliberate inside himself, made a decision. He would surpass Pereira's body count. He would become more notorious. He would make the world know his name too. This was not impulse. This was ambition, and there is nothing more terrifying than a violent man with a goal. In late November 1998, Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva walked out of the Rio Grande State Penitentiary a free man. He had served his time. He had completed his sentence. He returned to the coastal world he had always known. The salt air, the fishing docks, the familiar geography of the shoreline. But something had changed inside him, or perhaps something had always been there, coiled and waiting, because within weeks of his release, he began to hunt. Praia do Cassino is one of the longest beaches in the world, a vast, sweeping stretch of sand that runs along the southern coast of Rio Grande do Sul, connecting the city of Rio Grande to the Atlantic Ocean. During the Brazilian summer, which falls between December and March in the southern hemisphere, this beach becomes alive. Families come, young people come, couples come. They park their cars along the coastal roads in the evening, facing the water, fogging up windows, lost in each other with the careless trust of people who believe they are safe because they are in a public place. Paulo Sergio understood this. He had grown up here. He knew this beach the way a predator knows its territory. Every shadow, every stretch of road, every spot where a car might park far enough from others to feel private, close enough to the darkness that no one would hear what happened in time to stop it. He began visiting these spots, watching, waiting, and in December 1998, less than a month after walking free, he struck for the first time. Felipe Santos was 19 years old. Barbara da Silva was 22. They were parked near the edge of the water, a young couple sharing what should have been an unremarkable evening. What they did not know, what neither of them could have known, was that somewhere in the darkness surrounding their car, a man was approaching. He moved carefully. He moved like a man who had thought about this many times. When he reached them, there was no negotiation, no warning, no moment of hesitation that might have allowed for mercy. He shot them both. The bodies were found on December 12th, still in the car, parked near the sea. The scene was brutal in its efficiency. Two young lives ended with a coldness that would later come to define everything that made this case so deeply disturbing. Felipe Santos and Barbara da Silva had gone to the beach together and had been executed in the dark by a stranger who had chosen them for no reason other than the fact that they were there, that they were together, that they were exactly the kind of quiet, private, vulnerable target he had been watching for. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the community of Rio Grande. A double murder near the beach. A young couple, shot dead in their car. But at that point, no one yet understood what they were dealing with. Law enforcement began their investigation. 13 people would eventually be arrested before the real killer was identified. A detail that speaks volumes about how invisible Paulo Sergio had kept himself, how seamlessly he had blended back into the fabric of coastal life while carrying the weight of what he had done. And yet he continued. The summer moved forward. The beach filled up again. Couples still drove to their favorite spots. Life did not stop, because it rarely does after tragedy that hasn't yet shown its full shape. People grieve, people grow cautious, and then slowly the ordinary rhythms reassert themselves and the world feels safe again, or safe enough. Paulo Sergio depended on that. He was not finished. He was only beginning. The killings in December had not satisfied whatever was driving him, if satisfaction was even the right word for what he was chasing. He was counting. He was measuring himself against a number, against a name, against the ghost of Francisco de Assis Pereira and the infamy he had earned. 7 murders. That was Pereira's count, more or less, when the public thought about it. Paulo Sergio wanted more. He needed more. The murders were not random eruptions of violence. They were steps in a campaign, deliberate and structured, driven by a hunger for notoriety that twisted the act of killing into something that looked, from the inside of his mind, like achievement. The months between December and March were a waiting period. He moved carefully. He did not rush. The fisherman's patience, that long, still, unblinking patience, served him in a way that should make everyone who drives to a lonely stretch of road at night reconsider the comforting fiction that isolation means safety. When March arrived, he was ready again. And this time, he would leave not only bodies behind. He would leave a survivor, a witness whose testimony would eventually help seal the case against him and whose story would become one of the most harrowing accounts in the entire history of this case. But before that survivor, there would be more dead. In the community of Rio Grande, the unease that had settled after the December murders had not fully lifted. People talked. People wondered. But a single double murder, however shocking, does not yet create the full picture of what is being unleashed. It takes more death before the truth of a serial predator becomes undeniable. The police had arrested 13 suspects. They were working the case. But Paulo Sergio was not hiding. He was not in flight. He was living among them, walking the same streets, breathing the same sea air, and preparing for what came next. He watched the beach. He watched the couples. He watched the way the summer nights unfolded. The headlights pulling off the road, the engines cutting off, the silence that followed. And he began to move again, stepping out of one darkness and into another, hunting with the calm certainty of a man who believed he was invisible. The second round of killings would announce him to all of Brazil, and the way he behaved immediately afterward, standing among the people who came to discover what he had done, watching their faces, listening to their horror, would reveal something about the depth of his sickness that no profile, no forensic analysis, and no courtroom testimony could fully capture. He wanted an audience. He always had. March 1999 arrived the way Brazilian summers always do in the south. Still warm, still luminous at the edges, the kind of season that convinces people the world is generous and forgiving. Along Praia do Cassino, the days were bright and the nights carried that particular coastal electricity that makes young people drive out to the water and stay too long. Romance is bold when the air is warm and the sea is close. People park. People linger. And somewhere along the darkened coastal road, Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva was already watching the cars pull in. By March, he had been a free man for roughly 3 months. He had already killed twice. Felipe Santos and Barbara da Silva, their bodies found in December near the water, a case that had generated fear but not yet broken wide open into the full public terror that was coming. The police had cast a wide net and come up with the wrong fish. 13 suspects arrested, none of them the right one. The real predator was still out there, patient as ever, letting the weeks pass and the investigation flounder while he waited for his moment. Ana Maria Soares was 31 years old. Marcio Olinto was 30. They were found on March 10th at Praia do Todo, near the city of Pelotas, a discovery that changed the geography of the investigation entirely and revealed that Paulo Sergio was not confining himself to a single location. He was mobile. He was confident. A man who moves his hunting ground is a man who believes he will not be caught, or a man who does not care whether he is. Pelotas sits roughly 40 kilometers from Rio Grande. The bodies of Ana Maria and Marcio were found at a beach area known locally, a place where couples went for the same reasons couples went to Praia do Cassino: the privacy, the ocean, the shelter of darkness. They had been shot. The scene bore the same cold efficiency as the December killings. No struggle that suggested a prolonged confrontation. No evidence of a random encounter that had spiraled out of control. This was deliberate. This was a man who approached, acted, and withdrew, like something that had stepped out of the dark only long enough to do what it came for. The connection between the December murders and the March discovery was not immediately obvious to the public, but investigators were now looking at a pattern. Couples, coastal locations, nighttime, the same caliber of weapon, the same devastating outcome. Someone was hunting lovers on the beaches of Rio Grande do Sul, and the realization of that, when it truly landed, spread through the communities like a cold tide. But it was what came next, what happened only days after the bodies of Ana Maria and Marcio were found, that would become the defining atrocity of this entire case. The attack that would produce the sole survivor. The crime that would put a 14-year-old girl in Paulo Sergio's path and leave her crippled, violated, and shattered, and alive only because she had the presence of mind to do the one thing that might convince a killer he had finished his work. Patrick de Almeida was 18 years old. Brenda Graben was 14. They were at Praia do Cassino, the same beach where the first killings had occurred, a fact that in retrospect speaks to the audacity of a man who had no fear of returning to a crime scene. He had walked away clean before. He would do it again. That was the calculation, or perhaps there was no calculation at all. Perhaps it was simply hunger, the same patient, fisherman's hunger that brought him back to the same waters because that is where the prey gathered. Paolo Sergio approached the vehicle where Patrick and Brenda sat. He was armed. He was unhurried. He was, as he always seemed to be in those final terrible moments before the violence began, completely in control of himself, or whatever passed for control inside a mind like his. Patrick de Almeida died on the spot. Brenda Graben did not. But what she survived makes death seem, in certain dark moments, like the merciful alternative. Paolo Sergio shot her. She was wounded, crippled by the attack. The bullet leaving damage that would change the architecture of her body permanently. And then he raped her, a 14-year-old girl, bleeding, immobilized, terrified beyond the reach of language. And in the midst of that horror, she made a decision that saved her life. She went still. She controlled her breathing, her body, every instinct that screamed to her to move, to fight, to cry out. She convinced him she was dead. It worked. He left her there. The fact that she survived, the fact that Brenda Graben lived, became the most consequential moment in the entire case, because a dead victim cannot speak. A living one can. And when Brenda eventually told investigators what had happened to her, the details she provided would help construct the case that brought Paolo Sergio down. But on the night of that attack, none of that was known. There was only a wounded girl lying among the dead, waiting, listening, holding herself together with every remaining fragment of will, hoping that the darkness would last long enough for him to be gone before she had to breathe normally again. Paolo Sergio left the scene. He did not rush. He did not panic. He moved through the darkness the way he always did, with that measured, unhurried deliberateness that runs through this entire case like a thread of ice. And then he did something that reveals, more clearly than any forensic detail or psychological profile, exactly what kind of person he was. He stayed in the area. He positioned himself among the people who began arriving as the attack was discovered. Bystanders, early morning visitors, police officers. He stood with them. He listened. He watched their faces as they discovered what lay near the car. He absorbed their horror. He studied their grief. This is not the behavior of a man consumed by guilt or driven by impulse. This is the behavior of someone who regards the aftermath of killing as part of the experience, the audience reaction as integral to the performance as the act itself. Paolo Sergio wanted to see the impact of what he had done. He wanted to stand in the center of the chaos he had created and observe it from the inside. Whatever he felt in those moments, and we cannot know for certain, it was not remorse. It was something else entirely, something colder and more deliberate. He had done this before. After the December murders, witnesses later recalled that a man matching his description had lingered near the scene. After the March killings, the same pattern repeated. Stand close, watch carefully, let the horror wash around you. Feel whatever it is that makes you do this again and again. It is the detail that, more than any other, makes this case psychologically suffocating. A few days later, in the early hours of March 26th, Paolo Sergio struck for the final time. Silvio Ibias was 36 years old. Adriana Simmels was 28. They were parked in the coastal darkness, the way so many before them had been. The night was the same kind of night, warm, quiet, the ocean moving steadily in the background. And Paolo Sergio came out of the dark again, for the last time in this spree, and did what he had been doing since December. He shot them both. He killed them where they sat. And then he waited for the world to discover them. At this point, 7 people were dead. 3 additional victims had been attacked but survived. Attacked in both Rio Grande and Pelotas in incidents that formed part of the larger pattern. Each attack bore the same signature. Each scene carried the same atmosphere of cold, deliberate violence visited upon people who had been chosen for their vulnerability, their isolation, and their terrible luck in parking in the wrong place on the wrong night. The community of Rio Grande was by this point living in a state of genuine terror. The phrase that circulated, the maniac of Casino Beach, had entered local consciousness with the weight of a nightmare that could not be switched off. Young couples stopped going to the beach at night. Families locked their doors earlier. The long, beautiful stretch of Praia do Casino, one of the longest beaches in the world, had become a place of fear. The summer that should have meant freedom and warmth now carried the shadow of something watching from the dark. Police intensified their search. Investigators who had cast a wide net, arresting 13 people over the course of the investigation, none of them guilty of the murders, were now working with the testimony of a survivor and a body of physical evidence that was beginning to point in a specific direction. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The geography was too deliberate to be random. Someone who knew this coastline intimately was responsible. Someone who understood these beaches, who knew where couples gathered and where the darkness was thickest, who could move through this terrain without drawing attention to himself. A fisherman, a local man, someone who belonged here. In April 1999, the investigation began to close around Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva. His name emerged. His face began to connect to the pattern, and the police moved. By May 1999, he was in custody. The interrogation that followed produced a confession that was, in its own way, as disturbing as the crimes themselves, because Paulo Sergio did not attempt to deny what he had done. He did not construct an elaborate false narrative or pretend to be surprised by the accusations. Instead, he admitted it. 7 murders, multiple attempted murders, the rapes, the robberies that accompanied some of the attacks. He laid it out with a directness that investigators and journalists covering the case found deeply unsettling, not because confession is unusual, but because of the reason he gave for what he had done. He had been inspired, he said, by Francisco de Assis Pereira, the park maniac, the man who had killed women in São Paulo and become infamous across Brazil. Paulo Sergio had wanted to surpass that number. He had wanted to be more notorious. He had wanted the kind of dark recognition that another killer's infamy had showed him was possible. He had turned murder into competition. And in doing so, he had made his crime something that does not fit neatly into any of the categories we normally use to understand violence. This was not a man driven purely by rage, or by a specific hatred of a type of person, or by a compulsion born from trauma and spiraling out of control. This was ambition, warped, monstrous, incomprehensible ambition, the desire to be known, to rank, to be remembered in the worst possible way. He was 37 years old when he confessed. A fisherman, a man who had grown up on these beaches, who knew every inch of this coastline, who had spent his life reading the tides and the weather and the behavior of the sea. He had turned that same patient, observant intelligence toward human prey, and 7 people were dead because of it. There are cases in criminal history where the most powerful testimony does not come from a forensic expert, or a police investigator, or a prosecutor who has spent years building an airtight legal argument. The most powerful testimony comes from the person who looked into the face of the killer and somehow made it out alive. In the case of Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva, the casino maniac, that person was Brenda Graben. She was 14 years old on the night he attacked her. 14 years old, which means she was still carrying the particular fragility of a child. The not yet finished quality of someone who has not had enough years to build the armor that adults accumulate against the cruelty of the world. And Paulo Sergio came for her anyway, shot her, left her crippled, violated her, and walked away certain she was dead. The decision she made in those moments, to go still, to control every visible sign of life, to perform death convincingly enough to fool a man who had just killed her companion beside her, is one of the most harrowing acts of survival in Brazilian criminal history. It required the kind of psychological endurance that most adults would struggle to produce even in far less extreme circumstances. For a 14-year-old girl, bleeding and traumatized and alone in the dark next to a body, it was nothing short of extraordinary. Her survival changed everything. She became the axis around which the investigation eventually turned. A dead witness offers evidence. Physical, forensic, circumstantial. A living witness offers something far more difficult to dismiss. Memory, voice, identification, and the ability to stand in a courtroom and say, "This is what he did, and this is the man who did it." Brenda Graben's testimony, gathered carefully over the course of the investigation, helped build the picture that prosecutors would eventually present to a jury in February 2002. But before the trial, before the courtroom, there was the long and brutal period between Paulo Sergio's arrest in May 1999 and the day justice was finally delivered. a period during which a community had to live with the knowledge of what had been done on their beloved beach, among their familiar roads and favorite night spots. A period during which Brenda Graben had to live with her injuries, her trauma, and the particular weight of being the person who survived while others did not. The families of the victims of Felipe Santos, Barbara da Silva, Ana Maria Soares, Marcio Olinto, Petrick de Almeida, Silvio Ibias, Adriana Simmels, carried grief that is difficult to fully articulate. Their loved ones had done nothing to bring this upon themselves. They had simply loved each other and driven to the beach, which is what people do on warm summer nights in a coastal town in the south of Brazil. There was no element of risk they could have avoided, no precaution they had failed to take that might have saved them. They had been chosen at random, selected by proximity and vulnerability, and murdered by a man who was keeping account. That is the detail that sits at the center of this case and refuses to move. The keeping of account. The decision to model his crimes on another killer's body count and to measure his own success by how efficiently he could surpass it. It transforms the murders from acts of violence, which are already catastrophic, into something that carries an additional layer of dehumanization. The victims were not even individuals to Paulo Sergio in any meaningful sense. They were numbers, markers on a scale he was climbing, 7 of them before he was stopped. When he was arrested in May 1999, and when his confession circulated through the Brazilian press, the national reaction was one of profound horror. He was described by Diário do Grande ABC, one of the major newspapers covering the case, as the greatest serial killer in the history of Rio Grande do Sul at the time of his arrest. The description was accurate not only in terms of body count, but in terms of the calculated, sustained nature of the campaign he had conducted over those 5 months of killing. The investigation had been complex and, in some respects, troubled. 13 innocent people had been arrested over the course of the inquiry, a fact that speaks to the enormous pressure law enforcement was under to produce results, and to the difficulty of identifying a killer who left no obvious trail between his crimes. Paulo Sergio was not known to his victims. He did not target people he had a prior relationship with. He selected strangers, attacked them in darkness, and melted back into the community he shared with them. Finding him required the accumulation of forensic evidence, witness testimony, particularly Brenda Graben's, and the kind of investigative persistence that eventually brought the correct name to the surface. Once he confessed, the scale of his crimes became fully visible. 7 murders, 3 attempted murders, 1 rape, 2 attempted rapes, 3 robberies, additional attacks in the cities of Rio Grande and Pelotas that had not initially been connected to the beach killings. He had been more active and his territory wider than the first discoveries had suggested. The full accounting, when it came, was staggering. Prosecutors prepared a case that took nearly 3 years to reach trial. The Brazilian legal system, like many systems, moves through its processes at a pace that can feel almost unbearably slow to those waiting for judgment. For the families of the victims, those years between 1999 and 2002 were a particular kind of sustained anguish. Knowing the man who killed their children, their partners, their siblings was in custody, alive, while they grieved people who would never return. For Brenda Graben, the weight was accompanied by the physical reality of what he had done to her body. The injuries she had sustained left her crippled. She carried in her flesh the permanent record of the night Paulo Sergio came out of the dark. She had survived, yes, but survival in this context was not clean or complete. It was survival with scars, with limitations, with a body altered by violence in ways that could never be fully undone. In February 2002, the trial began. It lasted 2 days. The evidence was extensive, the testimony damning, and the jury unanimous. There was no reasonable doubt left to defend. Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva was convicted on all 14 counts: 7 homicides, 1 attempted murder, 3 robberies, 2 attempted robberies, and 1 rape. The jury delivered its verdict with the kind of decisiveness that reflects not only the strength of the evidence but the moral clarity of people confronted with the full accounting of what one man had done to their community. The initial sentence handed down in February 2002 was 171 years, 4 months, and 20 days imprisonment. It was a number that seemed designed to communicate something beyond the arithmetic of incarceration. A declaration that what Paulo Sergio had done was so far beyond the boundaries of acceptable human behavior that the law was reaching for its most extreme expression of condemnation. That sentence was later extended. The final figure reached 184 years and 10 months in prison. He became one of the prisoners carrying the highest sentences in the history of Rio Grande do Sul. Eighth on a list that, when surveyed in 2018, placed him among the most severely condemned individuals the state's criminal justice system had ever processed. He would never breathe free air again. That was the conclusion the law arrived at. 184 years. A number that exists not as a realistic sentence. No human being serves 184 years, but as a permanent statement of record. This is what you did. This is what it cost. You will die inside these walls. He was sent to the Charquetas high-security penitentiary, a facility appropriate to the severity of his crimes, a place that represented the furthest possible removal from the coastal world he had terrorized. No more beaches, no more summer nights, no more watching headlights pull off the road and waiting for the darkness to do its work. In 2007, Paulo Sergio made a request. He asked to be transferred from Charquetas to the Rio Grande State Penitentiary, the very city where so many of his crimes had been committed, the community he had terrorized, the families of his victims who still lived there. The court considered the request and dismissed it with pointed language. Moving him to the city where his crimes occurred, the court judged, risked creating social upheaval. In other words, the community that had suffered under him did not need to share a city with him again. The request denied, he remained at Charquetas. He remains there still, as far as public record indicates. A man now in his mid-50s, carrying a sentence he will never complete, in a facility far from the sea he once used as his hunting ground. Meanwhile, Brenda Graben, the girl who survived by pretending to be dead, went on living. In February 2020, nearly 21 years after the attack, she made a public appeal. The details of that appeal, her words, her continued existence, her insistence on speaking, serve as the most powerful possible counterweight to everything Paulo Sergio had tried to do. He had tried to kill her. He had failed. And she had not only survived but continued to raise her voice, continued to exist, continued to refuse the silence he had tried to impose on her with a gun and the weight of his terrible certainty. The families of those who did not survive continue to carry their grief in the way that all families of murder victims do. Not as something that diminishes over time, but as something that changes shape, becoming a permanent feature of the landscape of their lives. Felipe Santos never turned 20. Barbara da Silva never turned 23. Petrick de Almeida never turned 19. They are preserved in their youth in the memory of everyone who loved them. Forever the age they were on the night a fisherman came out of the dark and decided they should not live. The beach itself, Praia do Casino, one of the longest in the world, is still there. The waves still roll in. The summer still arrives in December, and the air still carries that warm coastal electricity that brings people out at night. The road where couples used to park has not vanished. Life has reasserted itself the way it always does, with a kind of relentless resilience that can look, from the outside, almost like indifference. But in the communities of Rio Grande and Pelotas, the name Titicaca still lands with a particular weight. The casino maniac, the fisherman who fished for blood, the man who turned the most romantic stretch of coastline in southern Brazil into a hunting ground and treated the counting of bodies like a sport. He is remembered. They are remembered too, all 7 of them. And in the remembering, the balance of that memory matters. After the trial, after the sentence, after the prison gates close and the cameras move on and the newspaper headlines age into archive files. After all of that, what remains? What does a case like this leave in its wake? What does a community do with the knowledge that a man lived among them, walked their streets, fished their waters, breathed their air, and spent months systematically killing people on their most beloved stretch of coastline? The answer, in Rio Grande do Sul, is the same answer communities across the world arrive at after they have been the site of something unthinkable. They heal, incompletely, unevenly, with long stretches of normalcy interrupted by sudden, sharp returns to grief. They memorialize in the ways they speak of the victims, in the annual recollections that keep the dead present in community consciousness. They change in the small behavioral adjustments that persist long after the immediate danger is gone, the instinct to look twice at a dark stretch of road, the second thought before parking somewhere isolated at night. Fear is not a temporary condition. It becomes architectural. It builds itself into the way people move through the world, and those structures last long after the thing that built them is locked away and unable to cause further harm. Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva left 7 deaths and an ocean of collateral damage behind him. The collateral damage is harder to count but no less real. There are the families of the victims, people who woke up one morning and went to bed that night in a world permanently and irrevocably altered. There are the surviving victims, those who were attacked and injured in Rio Grande and Pelotas during the same period, whose names are less prominent in the historical record but whose lives were fractured just as completely. There is Brenda Graben, who was 14 years old and is now a grown woman who has lived her entire adult life in the shadow of a night she did not choose. And there is the broader community. The fishermen and families and couples who stopped going to the beach at night, who looked differently at their neighbor, who learned in the worst possible way that danger does not always come from strangers in distant places. Sometimes it lives next door. Sometimes it goes to the same market, fixes its nets at the same dock, and watches you with quiet, patient eyes that give nothing away. The psychological profile of Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva is, in retrospect, a case study in the particular danger of goal-oriented predatory violence. Most serial killers operate within a framework that is, however distorted, internally consistent. They are driven by specific pathologies, specific needs, specific triggers that explain, though they never excuse, the pattern of their crimes. Paulo Sergio's stated motivation, the desire to surpass another killer's body count and achieve greater notoriety, places him in a category that criminal psychologists find especially difficult to contain within existing models. He was not driven by sexual compulsion alone, though the attack on Brenda Graben demonstrates that element was present. He was not driven by rage toward a specific type of person. His victims were not all the same age or the same gender, or connected by any characteristic beyond the terrible coincidence of being at the wrong place. He was driven by ambition, by competition, by the cold, clear-eyed decision to model his actions on another criminal's example and to judge his own success by how effectively he exceeded it. This is a motive that requires a level of abstract thinking, a capacity to step outside the immediate moment and situate oneself within a larger narrative. That speaks to a particular kind of intelligence applied to catastrophically destructive ends. Paulo Sergio was not a man who had lost control. He was a man who was in exquisite control of himself throughout, in the planning, in the approach, in the execution, in the deliberate choice to remain near the scenes of his crimes and observe the aftermath. He was conducting himself with the methodical patience of a craftsman. That the craft he was practicing was murder is the fact that makes it impossible to find any redemptive angle, any shadow of sympathy, in how he operated. The connection to Francisco de Assis Pereira, the park maniac, is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire story, because it raises questions about the nature of criminal notoriety and what it produces. Pereira became famous in 1998 through his crimes, through the media coverage those crimes generated, and through the public horror that turned his name into a byword for extreme violence. That fame, that notoriety, was absorbed by at least one other person sitting in a Brazilian prison and processed as inspiration, as a goal to exceed, as a model of success. It is a reminder that how we talk about killers, the level of attention we give them, the degree to which we allow their names to achieve a kind of dark celebrity has consequences. Not in every case, not inevitably, but in the specific case of Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva, the infamy of another killer was the direct catalyst for 7 murders on the beaches of southern Brazil. In the years following his conviction, Paulo Sergio faded from the national headlines the way most imprisoned criminals eventually do. The world moves on. New cases arise. New names enter the conversation. The casino maniac became a chapter in a book that Brazil has unfortunately had to keep adding chapters to. A country with its own long and disturbing record of serial violence, a record that includes names like Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Edson Isidoro Guimarães, and the man who had inspired Paulo Sergio himself, Francisco de Assis Pereira. But within the specific context of Rio Grande do Sul, his name retained its weight. The 2018 survey conducted by Pioneiro newspaper, which found him to be the 8th prisoner with the highest sentence in the state, placed him in a specific local hall of infamy, a ranking that carries its own grim significance. He had achieved, in prison, a version of the notoriety he had killed to obtain. He was on a list. He was a number. He was remembered, not in the way he had imagined, not as a figure of dark celebrity to be discussed in whispered admiration, but as a cautionary story, a case study in the furthest reaches of where human evil can travel when it is left unchecked and then released too early. Because that is perhaps the element of this story that deserves the loudest attention. Even now, Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva had a prior conviction for attempted murder. He served 9 years and was released. He walked out of the Rio Grande State Penitentiary in late November 1998 and was killing people within weeks. The system that released him was not wrong in its mechanics. He had served his time, met the legal standard for release, and had no pending charges. But the outcome of that release was 7 murders, multiple sexual assaults, and a community left permanently scarred. At what point does a prior conviction for attempted murder become a signal that a man should not be returned to free society? At what point does the justice system's obligation to rehabilitate and release come into direct conflict with the community's right to safety from someone who has already demonstrated a capacity and willingness to kill? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that the case of Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva places before us with unflinching directness. He should never have been in a position to kill those 7 people. The question of who bears responsibility for the structural failure that put him back on that beach is one that every country with a criminal justice system should be asking, not as an abstraction, but as a concrete, practical reckoning with the consequences of how we manage violent offenders. The victims deserve that reckoning. Felipe Santos deserves it. Barbara da Silva deserves it. Ana Maria Soares and Marcio Olinto and Patrick de Almeida and Silvio Ibias and Adriana Simmels. All of them deserve the dignity of being more than case files, more than names in a true crime narrative, more than statistics in a discussion about recidivism and sentencing policy. They were people. Felipe was 19 and had his whole life still unspoken in front of him. Barbara was 22 and had not yet had enough time to understand who she was fully becoming. Ana Maria was 31. An adult, a woman with a life built and relationships maintained and a future that a night on the beach was supposed to have nothing to do with ending. Marcio was 30, the same. Patrick was 18, barely past the beginning. Silvio was 36, old enough to have lived, not old enough to have lived enough. Adriana was 28, at that particular age where life has started to open up with genuine possibility. They are gone because a man decided that killing them would make him famous. He was wrong about the kind of famous it made him. It made him infamous, a distinction that matters in the way the world holds his memory. His name is spoken with revulsion, not with the dark admiration he seems to have been chasing. The competition he imagined himself in with Francisco de Assis Pereira produced not a winner but 2 entries in a catalogue of shame. Brenda Graben outlived the night he left her for dead. She outlived the trial. She outlived the sentence. She outlived the news cycle and the public attention and the moment when the cameras finally moved on. She spoke out in 2020, 2 decades later, still here, still carrying her story, still insisting on being heard. That is its own kind of victory, not the kind that comes with ceremony or acknowledgement, but the quiet, devastating kind that belongs only to those who survived something that was designed to silence them. The casino maniac sits in his cell at Charquetas. He is in his mid-50s. He will die there, in all likelihood, beneath the weight of a sentence that was constructed to ensure he never again stands in the dark near a coastal road and waits for headlights to pull off the highway. And Praia do Casino, that vast, extraordinary stretch of southern Brazilian coastline, continues to exist. One of the longest beaches in the world. Still beautiful, still warm in the summer, still drawing people who drive down to the water in the evening and sit together watching the ocean move. They go, perhaps, without thinking about what happened there in 1998 and 1999. Most of them are too young to remember. Some of them were not yet born. For them, the beach is just the beach. Beautiful and indifferent and entirely without the shadow that fell across it in those few terrible months when a fisherman decided that its darkness belonged to him. But some people remember. The families remember. The community remembers. Brenda Graben remembers every single day in ways that no amount of time will fully dissolve. And in the remembering, the true nature of what Paulo Sergio Guimarães da Silva took from this world becomes fully visible. Not just 7 lives. Not just the physical destruction recorded in court documents and forensic reports, but the ripple, the long, spreading, permanent ripple of grief and fear and alteration that moves outward from an act of violence and never fully stops. He fished for infamy. He caught only ruin. For everyone, including himself. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Prophet of Blood. This is the story of Febronio Indio do Brasil, aka the Son of Light, the tattooing demon of Rio. He did not believe he was a killer. He believed he was a god. And that made him infinitely more dangerous than any man who simply wanted you dead. Picture this. Rio de Janeiro, 1927. The city is electric, carnival heat, samba drifting through cobblestone streets, the jungle pressing dark and close against the edges of civilization. And somewhere in the shadow between those worlds, a man with a needle, a rope, and a self-authored religion is hunting young men and boys, not out of rage, not out of hunger, not out of greed, but out of divine conviction. He did not stalk victims in the way that most killers do, skulking in doorways with trembling hands. He walked in broad daylight, dressed like a gentleman, speaking in scripture, promising jobs, promising futures, promising salvation. And when he had his prey alone, in a forest, on an island, in the dark belly of a ravine, he would pull out his needle, his thread, and his red paint, and carve a sacred code into living flesh before extinguishing the light behind their eyes. His name, the one he gave himself, the one that would keep Brazilian parents awake at night for decades to come, was Febronio Indio do Brasil. And this every last suffocating, terrifying, incomprehensible chapter of it is completely, verifiably, historically true. Some men are forged in quiet places, shaped slowly by comfort, education, or love. Febronio Ferreira de Matos was forged in violence, in poverty, in blood that was not his own, and in the relentless darkness of a home where no child should have been asked to survive. He entered this world on January 14, 1895, in the small, remote municipality of São Miguel de Jequitinhonha, buried deep in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, a place far removed from the lights of any city, far removed from any institution that might have caught what was growing inside him, far removed from anyone with the clinical vocabulary to name what his father was doing to his family and to him. Teodoro Simões de Oliveira was his father's name, a farmer by trade, a butcher on the side, and an alcoholic by compulsion. Teodoro was the kind of man whose presence in a room caused every person in it to go very still. He drank, and when he drank, he became a storm that moved through the walls of that small house without remorse. His wife, Reginalda Ferreira de Matos, absorbed the violence that the man generated as though it were weather, as though it were simply the climate of her existence. She was beaten regularly, savagely, in front of her 14 children. 14. Febronio was the second of them, old enough to witness what was happening, young enough to carry the wound of it for the rest of his life. What does it do to a child, specifically to this child, to grow up watching the person he loves most in the world be broken apart repeatedly by the person who is supposed to protect her? Psychologists and criminologists who would one day study Fabronio's mind would argue at length about what that early exposure to violence seeded inside him. What we know is what we can observe. The boy who grew up in Theodoro's house did not become a man capable of pity. He did not become a man who could feel the weight of another person's suffering as his own. What he became instead was something far more complex and far more dangerous. At the age of 12, in approximately 1907, Fabronio made a decision that many abused children make when the walls close in too tightly. He left, not in a dramatic fashion, not with any particular plan. He simply slipped away from Jequitinhonha in the company of a traveling salesman passing through the region, hitching himself to the road like a piece of flotsam riding a current. He wandered through the localities around his hometown, surviving on instinct, learning to read in the city of Diamantina, where he also earned a living working as a butler for wealthier families. He moved to Belo Horizonte next, surviving there as a shoe shiner and domestic servant, always moving, always watching, developing the one skill that would serve his future crimes above all others, the ability to read people, to find what they wanted, and to become it. By approximately 1909, at the age of 14, Fabronio had reached Rio de Janeiro, then the federal capital of Brazil, a sprawling, chaotic, luminous, and deeply unequal city. He returned briefly to the state of Minas Gerais in 1916 under the borrowed name of Pedro de Souza, then came back to Rio, and it was in Rio that his criminal career properly began. Between 1916 and 1929, the police in Rio de Janeiro would document his name dozens of times across a range of offenses: fraud, blackmail, bribery, theft, robbery, vagrancy. He slipped in and out of custody with disturbing ease, wearing different names like different coats, each identity constructed just well enough to fool whoever needed fooling at that particular moment. But none of what came before could prepare anyone for what happened in 1920. That year, during one of his many arrests, Fabronio was sent to the Dois Rios Correctional Facility on Ilha Grande, a correctional colony on an island off the coast of Rio de Janeiro state. He was 25 years old. In the intervals between work sessions at the facility, he had taken to reading the Bible page by careful page, in the way that a man searches for something he cannot name. And then, one night, he found something, or something found him. He had a vision. In this vision, a woman appeared to him. She was tall, with long blonde hair, and she moved toward him through the dark of his cell with the unhurried certainty of something divine. She told him that he was chosen, that he was the Son of Light, that God had not died, and that it was Fabronio's sacred responsibility to go out into the world and declare this truth. As part of this divine assignment, the woman instructed him to tattoo young men and boys with a specific symbol, the letters DCVXVI, which, according to his expanding personal theology, stood for the Portuguese words meaning God, charity, virtue, holiness, life, and magnet of life. The tattoo, she told him, would serve as a talisman. It would protect those who bore it. It would stave off the end of the world. Standing alone in his cell in the hours that followed this vision, Fabronio did not dismiss it as a dream. He embraced it as commission. He tattooed his own chest with the words that translated to, "Behold the Son of Light," and encircled his entire torso with the letters DCVXVI. He had baptized himself inside a prison. He had created a religion whose congregation consisted entirely of unwilling victims. And from that moment forward, Fabronio Ferreira de Matos ceased to exist. The man who walked out of that correctional facility, released in mid-1921, had a new name, a new identity, and a mission. He called himself Fabronio Indio do Brasil. What followed his release was a pattern that reveals the profound cunning operating beneath the layers of religious delusion. Within weeks of emerging from the correctional colony, Fabronio constructed an elaborate, legitimate-sounding enterprise. He placed an advertisement in the Correio de Manha, one of Rio's major newspapers, announcing the formation of the Auxiliadora Medica, a medical consumers cooperative. The advertisement attracted a dentist named Dr. Bruno Ferreira Gabina, who joined the venture and allowed Fabronio, presenting himself as Joaquim Indio do Brasil, to assist him with appointments. The arrangement lasted approximately 1 month before both men vacated the rented office without paying. But Fabronio had gained something infinitely more valuable than a month of rent-free occupation. He had gained the dentist's diploma. What happened to Dr. Bruno Ferreira Gabina after that month is one of the most chilling unanswered questions in this entire case. The dentist was never seen again. Not by colleagues, not by acquaintances, not by his own mother, Maria Ferreira Gabina, who would spend years searching for her son without result. It was never proven in court that Fabronio killed him. But the man simply vanished from the earth at precisely the moment that Fabronio acquired his credentials, and no one who has studied this case has ever come up with an innocent explanation for that timing. Armed with the stolen diploma, Fabronio opened his own dental practice in 1922 on Rua Visconde do Rio Branco in the Centro district of Rio de Janeiro. What transpired inside those walls was not dentistry. It was sadism wearing a clinical mask. Patients who came seeking treatment found themselves subjected to extractions of perfectly healthy teeth, pulled without necessity or justification, while Fabronio observed their pain with what witnesses would describe as detached pleasure. His reputation collapsed quickly enough that he was forced to pivot, transforming the dental practice into a fraudulent employment agency. A scheme in which desperate people looking for work deposited money with him in exchange for promises he had no intention of keeping. When the police drew too close, he fled Rio entirely. By 1925, he had relocated to Bahia, where he continued practicing fraudulent dentistry under the name Fabronio Simões de Melo Indio do Brasil. From Bahia, he moved again, settling in the town of Mimoso do Sul in the state of Espírito Santo, where this time he presented himself not as a dentist but as a full physician, Dr. Gabina. In this role, practicing medicine with no qualification beyond a stolen identity and a willingness to deceive, Fabronio was held responsible for the deaths of 2 children to whom he prescribed inappropriate medication. He disappeared from that town before justice could find him. He resurfaced in Rio Casca, a mining settlement, where presenting himself as Dr. Euseda Filho he continued his medical frauds, and caused the death of a woman during childbirth. The trail of bodies he left behind him in these early years was not the trail of a compulsive murderer yet. Not precisely. It was the trail of a man to whom other people's lives meant nothing, a man in whom the circuitry of empathy had never properly connected. But back in Rio de Janeiro, where he eventually returned, the vision was still burning. The woman with the long blonde hair was still speaking to him. The mission was not yet fulfilled. On October 8, 1926, police arrested Fabronio on Sugarloaf Mountain after observing him behaving suspiciously. When examined, he presented with delusional ideas and a compulsive inability to tell the truth, and he was admitted to the National Psychopath Hospital. During this hospitalization, the distinguished psychiatrist Dr. Adaudo Botelho examined him and became the first clinician to formally diagnose Fabronio with a mental disorder. But the system was not yet equipped to contain what it had identified. He was released within weeks. In January 1927, Fabronio was arrested yet again, this time at the 4th Auxiliary Police Station in Rio de Janeiro. While held there in a shared cell, he sexually assaulted 2 of his cellmates. When he turned his attention to a 3rd prisoner, a man named Jalma Rosa resisted, and Fabronio beat him to death. The first murder that could be definitively attributed to him was committed inside a police station. The man that Brazil was holding in a detention cell was capable of killing someone with his bare hands when denied what he wanted. And the authorities, despite everything they had seen, despite every warning sign that had been accumulating over a decade, released him again. What came next would make the streets of Rio de Janeiro feel like somewhere a parent should not let a child walk alone. There is a particular terror in a predator who does not look like one. The wolves that terrify us most in folklore are those who wear something else's skin, who speak in gentle voices, who make promises that sound like gifts. Fabronio Indio do Brasil had refined this art to a horrifying precision by the time he was walking the streets of Rio de Janeiro in 1927. He did not lurk. He did not threaten. He approached his targets with the practiced warmth of a man who seemed to want nothing more than to improve their circumstances. Offering employment, promising salaries, presenting himself as someone with connections, with resources, with doors to open. And because the men and boys he targeted were invariably poor, invariably struggling, invariably hungry for exactly the kind of opportunity he described, they went with him willingly. This is what makes his case so deeply unsettling even now, nearly a century removed from the crimes themselves. He did not overpower his victims in the street. He persuaded them. He walked them, smiling and conversational, directly into the wilderness of their own endings. On February 21st, 1927, police received a report that a man had been spotted on the hill of Corcovado, the famous mountain that would later become home to the statue of Christ the Redeemer. What responding officers found at the scene was unlike anything they had documented before. Fabronio was there, completely naked, his body painted head to toe in yellow pigment, dancing in front of a child who had been tied to the trunk of a tree. The child was terrified, frozen in the particular stillness of extreme fear, unable to do anything but stare at this painted figure moving around him in some private ritual that made no sense in any language that sanity could translate. The officers arrested Fabronio and returned him to the National Psychopath Hospital. But before they did, witnesses at the scene told the investigating officers something else. In the days prior to this incident, those same witnesses said they had watched Fabronio boiling something in a pot inside the house where he was renting a room. Something that, upon closer examination, turned out to be a human head, stolen, it would later be determined, from the Kaju cemetery. A stolen human head, boiling in a domestic pot. A naked man painted yellow, dancing around a bound child on a sacred mountain. This was not ordinary criminal behavior. This was the manifestation of a mind that had constructed an entirely self-contained reality, one with its own theology, its own rituals, its own logic, and had been acting within that reality for years while the world around it struggled to recognize what it was looking at. The eminent physician Dr. Juliano Moreira examined Fabronio during this second hospitalization, assisted by Dr. Enrique Roxo, and both physicians confirmed what Dr. Botello had observed months earlier. Fabronio was mentally ill. They recommended continued hospitalization. But the institutional infrastructure of Brazil in 1927 was simply not built to hold someone like him indefinitely on the strength of psychiatric recommendation alone, and in April of that year, Fabronio was admitted to the National Hospice of the Insane at Praia Vermelha. When he was discharged from the hospice, Fabronio did not leave alone. He took with him a 17-year-old fellow patient named Jacob Edelman, who had also been discharged and to whom Fabronio had made a seemingly reasonable offer, employment in his dental office. Jacob, young and trusting and carrying the vulnerabilities that came with his own difficult circumstances, agreed. The two traveled together to Mangaratiba, a coastal town southwest of Rio. On the journey, Fabronio had also recruited a second young man, another 17-year-old named Octavio de Bernardi, who had been promised work in a slaughterhouse. In the darkness of a deserted location in Mangaratiba, while Octavio stood watching in terrified silence, Fabronio tattooed the inscription DCVXVI onto Jacob's chest. He performed the procedure with a needle, thread, and paint. Not quickly, not mercifully, but with the focused deliberation of a man performing a sacred act. He needed Jacob to be still for this. He needed Jacob to cooperate, or at least to be too frightened not to. A few days later, at a wasteland called Praia das Flechiras on the western end of Governador Island, a strip of desolate coast that would later be transformed into the ground beneath Galeão International Airport, Fabronio violated Jacob sexually. And then, having first performed the tattoo ritual on Octavio as well, he violated Octavio in the same manner. Both young men were released afterward, shaking and scarred and alive, but only barely, and only by what may have been some shift in Fabronio's internal arithmetic at that particular moment, some calculus of divine instruction that left their lives intact where it would not leave others the same mercy. He continued his campaign in August 1927, targeting an 18-year-old named Manuel Alves with the same reliable weapon, a promise of work, before tattooing him. When he was subsequently held at the house of detention, Fabronio repeated his sexual assaults against cellmates, treating incarceration as simply another environment in which to enact his dominion over the bodies of others. He was released on August 8, 1927, after a jury acquitted him of the earlier charge related to Jalma Rosa's death. a decision that would be followed almost immediately by events that made clear precisely what that acquittal had placed back onto the streets of Rio de Janeiro. When he walked out of the house of detention on August 8th, Fabronio was wearing a navy blue uniform and a cap that belonged to a cellmate. He had stolen them. This detail would matter enormously in the days that followed. On August 13th, 1927, Fabronio approached the family of a 20-year-old man named Alamiro Jose Ribeiro. He was polished, composed, convincing, presenting himself as a businessman with an opportunity that Alamiro should not pass up. He explained to the family, running a bus company, and he was looking for a driver. Would Alamiro be willing to come along and discuss the details? The family, having no reason to distrust the well-spoken gentleman standing at their door, gave their permission. Alamiro left with Fabronio willingly. They traveled to Ribeiro Island, near the district of Jacarepagua. There, in the dense green cover of the forest where no one could see or hear what was happening, Fabronio made his intentions clear. He made advances toward Alamiro. Alamiro refused him. In most confrontations, refusal carries no greater cost than the discomfort of the moment itself. But this was not most confrontations. This was a man whose understanding of the world contained no space for the word no when it came from a prey he believed had been designated for his purpose. Fabronio killed Alamiro Jose Ribeiro with a green vine he found on the forest floor. He wrapped it around the young man's throat and pulled until Alamiro's body stopped fighting back. He stripped the body and dressed it in his own clothing, leaving Alamiro lying in the undergrowth like something the forest had discarded. 2 days later, on August 15th, the body was found. On that same day, August 15th, the morning that Alamiro's body was discovered, Fabronio was already moving toward his next victim. He found a 16-year-old boy named Joaquim and, using the same practiced story of employment, tattooed him with the sacred code. Joaquim managed to escape. He was one of the fortunate ones. The ones who were not fortunate were running out of time. Fabronio, apparently aware that the discovery of Alamiro's body was generating alarm across Rio, traveled to the city of Petropolis and checked into room 3 of Hotel Rio Branco under the name of Dr. Gabina, a name he had been borrowing for years from a man whose whereabouts remained entirely unknown. In Petropolis, he visited a tailor, ordered a new suit, and exchanged the navy uniform he had worn during Alamiro's murder for fresh clothing, effectively shedding the physical evidence of his crime like a snake sheds skin. When the tailor came to collect the second installment of payment, Fabronio noticed a cyst on the man's neck and, with the reflexive sadism that lived just beneath every interaction he had with the world, offered to treat it. He applied iodine tincture, then drove a knife suddenly into the cyst, causing a hemorrhage that sent the tailor fleeing in pain and terror without collecting a cent. Fabronio found this amusing. He returned to Rio de Janeiro. On August 29th, 5 days before police would locate his previous victim, Fabronio positioned himself near a residential neighborhood and found 10-year-old João Ferreira, a boy known to everyone in the neighborhood by the affectionate nickname Janjoka. He was small, young, trusting. Fabronio approached his parents. He had a position, he said, for a butler, a fine opportunity for a boy of Janjoka's age, a uniform, perhaps, a respectable placement. The parents, like so many before them, had no reason to see through the performance. They gave their son permission to go. Janjoka left holding the hand of the last adult who would ever earn his trust. In the woods near Largo do Franca, Fabronio offered the child a deal. He would give him a suit as a present, a fine new suit, the kind of gift a working boy could be proud of, if Janjoka would agree to receive the same tattoo as his companion. Frightened but faced with a man who offered comfort and rewards alongside the strangeness of the request, Janjoka consented. Fabronio produced his needle, his thread, and his red paint, and performed the ritual on the body of a 10-year-old child. Then they went to the forest of Ribeiro Island, the same stretch of dark, quiet land where Alamiro had been murdered, and there, Fabronio strangled Janjoka with a rope. The boy's body was found on September 7th, lying naked approximately 300 meters from where Alamiro's corpse had been discovered weeks earlier. The two victims, a 20-year-old man and a 10-year-old child, lying in the same forest, marked by the same hand, separated by no more than the particular timing of one man's divine schedule. The city of Rio de Janeiro did not sleep easily after that. In the days between the discovery of Alamiro's body on August 15th and the discovery of John Joca's on September 7th, Rio de Janeiro underwent a transformation that cities undergo when they realize that something they cannot fully see is moving among them. Parents stopped letting children walk to school alone. Men who ordinarily moved through the streets without a second thought found themselves evaluating strangers with new wariness. The newspapers, which had covered Fabronio's earlier arrests in clinical terms, began to shift their language. The man was no longer a curiosity or a criminal footnote. He was something else, something that required a different kind of vocabulary, a darker register of fear. The investigation that would ultimately bring Fabronio to justice began the way so many investigations begin, not with sophisticated forensic analysis but with memory. When police were notified on August 16th that a body had been found on Ribeiro Island, they observed near Alamiro's corpse a navy blue cap lying on the ground. One of the investigating officers paused. Something about that cap triggered a recollection. Days earlier, he had heard a report of a recently released detainee leaving the house of detention wearing a cap matching that description. He returned to the prison, showed Fabronio's mugshot photograph to the staff, and was told that yes, the cap had been taken by Fabronio Indio do Brazil on the day of his release. This was the thread that would unravel everything. The photograph was taken to Alamiro's father. The man looked at the image of Fabronio and did not hesitate. That was the man who had come to his house presenting himself as a bus company owner. That was the man who had offered his son a job and left with him on the day of his disappearance. The identification was immediate and absolute, the certainty of grief recognizing the face of what caused it. Police spread the mugshot across the city. Witnesses came forward. Reports accumulated. A picture emerged of a man who had been extraordinarily active in the weeks leading up to Alamiro's death. Approaching young men in streets, on hill paths, outside train stations, always with the same story, always with the same carefully manufactured air of respectability and opportunity. The city began to understand that the person they were looking for was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was the man who had offered your son a job. He was the man you had almost let into your home. The search for Fabronio dominated the press and the public imagination in the weeks that followed. His crimes were reported in extraordinary detail across the major Rio newspapers, generating public terror at a scale that few criminal cases in the city's history had previously managed. The name Fabronio Indio do Brazil moved through the city like a contagion, whispered in markets, shouted across courtyards, printed in heavy type above photographs that made readers set their newspapers down and stare at walls. During this period, Fabronio was not in hiding in any conventional sense. He was moving, yes, traveling between Rio, Petropolis, and back, but he was doing so with the calm of a man who did not experience danger the way other people did. His internal world remained entirely intact, insulated from the external reality of manhunts and newspaper headlines by the unshakable architecture of his delusion. He was the son of light. He was fulfilling a divine commission. The fact that human authorities wanted to stop him was, in his cosmology, simply the eternal resistance of the ignorant against the sacred. He was not afraid. He was righteous. It was this quality, this absolute imperviousness to ordinary fear, that made him so difficult to contain by conventional means and so terrifying to encounter in person. People who came into contact with him during this period described a man who maintained eye contact with an unnerving steadiness, who spoke about his religion and his mission with the calm conviction of someone recounting ordinary daily plans, and whose warmth and apparent normalcy made the reality of what he had done feel almost impossible to reconcile with the person standing in front of them. On August 31st, 1927, police finally located Fabronio. He was spotted boarding a train at Leopoldina Station on the Leopoldina Railroad, not running, not disguised, not behaving in any manner that suggested a man who knew the entire police apparatus of Rio de Janeiro was looking for him. He was simply getting on a train. Officers approached and led him to the 4th Auxiliary Police Station. At the station, recognition came swiftly and from a devastating source. John Joca's father was there. He looked at the man the officers had brought in, and he knew. That was the man who had appeared at his door with a story about a butler's position. That was the man who had taken his 10-year-old son's hand and walked away with him and never brought him back. In the days of interrogation that followed, Fabronio did not break in the way that investigators typically hope a suspect will break, with remorse, with terror, with the psychological collapse of someone whose lies have been dismantled. He had no lies to maintain. He had his truth, and his truth was coherent to him in ways that the investigators found deeply disorienting. He acknowledged the killings not as confessions of wrongdoing but as declarations of sacred purpose. On September 2nd, the delegate Dr. Oliveira Ribeiro obtained Fabronio's statement regarding Alamiro's death. On September 8th, Fabronio formally admitted to Janjoka's murder as well, stating plainly that he had committed both killings as sacrifices to the living God, in service of the religion he had built from a vision in a prison cell years earlier. On September 19, 1927, the public prosecutor's office formally arraigned Fabronio for the murders of Alamiro José Ribeiro and João Ferreira. 2 days later, he was transferred from the police station to the house of detention under prisoner number 194. The press response was immediate and overwhelming. On September 21, 1927, the newspaper O Journal launched a multi-part series titled The Criminal Fabronio Before Psychiatry, which ran for nearly 2 weeks and featured exclusive interviews with the leading medical and legal minds of Rio de Janeiro. Dr. Faustino Esposal, professor of neurology at the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Rio de Janeiro, was the first to be interviewed. He was followed by Dr. Pedro Pernambuco Filho, and then by Dr. Enrique Roxo, the physician who had examined Fabronio earlier that same year. All three experts reached identical conclusions. Fabronio suffered from mental illness that motivated his crimes, and he needed to be institutionalized in a psychiatric facility rather than processed through the ordinary criminal justice system, the Juris DR. Evaristo de Moraes added his voice to the growing consensus on October 4th, recommending Fabronio's transfer to a mental asylum and noting the inadequacy of the treatment he had received during his earlier hospitalizations. The legal community and the medical community were, for once, speaking with one voice on this case, and what they were saying was that Brazil was confronting something it had never formally confronted before. A man who was beyond the reach of punishment as traditionally conceived, whose actions emerged from a place in the mind where ordinary deterrence could not penetrate. In 1928, Fabronio was brought before a jury presided over by Judge Dr. Ari de Azevedo. His defense attorney was Dr. Latacio Jansen, who argued criminal inculpability on the grounds of manifest mental illness. The forensic examination of Fabronio was assigned to Dr. Heitor Cariu, who conducted one of the most thorough and consequential psychiatric evaluations in Brazilian legal history. On February 20, 1928, Dr. Cariu, assisted by Dr. Manuel Clemente Rayo, submitted an extensive expert report that would change Brazilian jurisprudence permanently. The report reached 4 conclusions. First, that Fabronio Indio do Brasil carried a constitutional psychopathy characterized by ethical deviations, encompassing moral madness and instinctive perversions expressed as homosexuality with sadistic impulses, combined with delusional ideas of a mystical and imaginary character. Second, that his criminal acts arose directly from this morbid psychological condition, which prevented him from exercising normal control over his will. Third, that his capacity for criminal responsibility was therefore impaired or eliminated entirely. Fourth, and this was the conclusion that would echo forward through every Brazilian criminal proceeding involving mental illness that followed, that because the abnormal manifestations of his mentality defined his inescapable danger to society, he must be permanently segregated from the public in a facility appropriate for delinquent psychopaths. The jury, armed with this medical argument, acquitted Fabronio of criminal responsibility for the murders. Judge de Azevedo ordered his indefinite institutional confinement. On June 6, 1929, Fabronio was placed in the newly established Judiciary Nursery of Rio de Janeiro, becoming its first inmate. He was 34 years old. He would not breathe free air again for the remainder of his life. There is a peculiar horror in longevity. Most narratives of violent crime find their natural conclusion in a courtroom, in a sentence, in the finality that punishment is supposed to provide for everyone involved, for victims, for families, for societies trying to convince themselves that the wound can close. The case of Febronio Indio do Brazil offered none of that finality. What it offered instead was the image of a man continuing to exist, decade after decade, within the walls of an institution that had been built, in part, to hold him. He walked in at 34. He was still there at 89. The Judiciary Nursery of Rio de Janeiro, which was formally renamed the Heitor Cariu Judicial Asylum in 1954 in honor of its first director, became in many ways the world that Febronio inhabited from 1929 until the moment of his death. He was not simply stored there. He was periodically examined, evaluated, subjected to the psychiatric treatments available at each particular moment in medical history, treatments that evolved considerably across the 5+ decades of his confinement. In the early years, these included electroconvulsive therapy, administered as part of ongoing attempts to assess whether his condition had stabilized or deteriorated. The goal of each successive examination was specific and formal, to determine whether Febronio's dangerousness had diminished to a level that would make discharge safe, or whether it remained at a level that required continued segregation. It always remained. Every assessment, every evaluation, every clinical report produced across those decades reached the same conclusion: Febronio was still dangerous. The architecture of his delusion had not crumbled. The mission had not faded. The son of light had simply found himself confined to a smaller stage. On February 8, 1935, Febronio demonstrated that his ingenuity had survived his incarceration intact. Taking advantage of a moment of distraction caused by the arrival of the morning shift of employees at the asylum, he constructed an escape device from the materials available to him, sheets that he had laced together into a long rope and fashioned at its end into a hook using the handles from buckets. With this improvised tool, he scaled the 4-meter wall of the judicial asylum and dropped to the other side. The escape lasted less than 24 hours. A man named Bernardino Barbosa, who had agreed, at the request of Febronio's brother Iginor, to allow a guest to stay at his house in the Rio neighborhood of Honorio Gurgel, woke the following morning and read his newspaper. On the front pages, alongside the story of the escape, was the face of his overnight houseguest. Bernardino went immediately to the police. Officers arrived and found Febronio exactly where Bernardino had left him, completely naked, as he had been found many times before, seemingly indifferent to his exposure and to the world's reaction to it. He was returned to the judicial asylum. He never left again. What were those remaining decades like inside those walls? The records speak in the distant language of institutional documentation. Psychiatric evaluations, medical reports, administrative entries. But the human reality can be partially reconstructed from the accounts of those who encountered him during his later years, particularly the forensic psychiatrist Dr. Talvain Marins de Moraes, who accompanied Febronio through the final years of his institutional life and was the last major clinical presence to engage with his case directly. Dr. Moraes would eventually revise the foundational diagnosis that Dr. Cariu had issued in 1928, where Cariu had characterized Febronio's condition using the framework of moral madness, a diagnostic category rooted in the theoretical models of Kretschmer, Freud, and Pritchard. Dr. Moraes, working with the more refined diagnostic tools that psychiatry had developed across the intervening decades, concluded that Febronio had suffered from hebephrenic paranoid schizophrenia. This was not merely an academic reclassification. It reframed everything. The visions, the religious elaborations, the absolute certainty of divine mission, the dissociation from ordinary social reality that allowed him to kill young men and children with the same emotional register that a craftsman brings to a day's work. He was not pretending. He was not choosing evil within a framework of understood morality and selecting it anyway. He existed in a world that the rest of humanity could not enter or fully map. A world in which the woman with the long blonde hair was as real as any judge or journalist or victim's father, in which the letters DCVXVI carved into living skin were as genuinely sacred as any scripture, in which the murders were not murders at all but ceremonies, necessary and holy and ordained. This is not written to generate sympathy for him. Sympathy is not owed by the dead child John Joka to the man who strangled him with a rope. Sympathy is not owed by Alamiro's father to the man who used a vine to end his son's life in a forest. What it is written to establish is the particular and terrible quality of the danger he represented, a danger that ordinary human comprehension of evil, ordinary frameworks of guilt and punishment, ordinary mechanisms of deterrence were constitutionally incapable of addressing. You cannot frighten a man into compliance when the man does not experience the world the way you experience it. Outside the walls of the asylum, meanwhile, Fabronio had become something else entirely. He had become a cultural institution, not in celebration, but in the far more ancient and visceral register of the cautionary myth. Brazilian parents in the 1930s used his name the way parents across centuries have used the names of monsters, as a warning, as a behavioral lever, as a shape given to the formless threat that children are told waits for the disobedient. Be careful, or Fabronio will come for you. The name itself, that specific, strange, impossible-to-forget name, became so thoroughly contaminated by its association with violence and madness that it was reportedly prohibited as a birth registration name for children born in the 1930s. No parent in Brazil in that decade wanted to give their child a name that was synonymous with a bogeyman who cut symbols into the bodies of boys. The cultural reverberations did not stop with parents and frightened children. The modernist literary world of Brazil absorbed Fabronio as subject matter with a speed that reflected the deep unease he generated in the national imagination. Prominent authors of the era, among them Antonio de Alcântara Machado, Aníbal Machado, Pedro Nava, and Rubem Fonseca, incorporated references to Fabronio into their works, using him as a figure through whom to examine the relationship between civilization and its psychic shadows, between the ordered surface of society and the chaos that lives beneath it. Between 1928 and 1935, Fabronio became the subject of carnival marching songs. The rhythm of samba absorbing even the most disturbing chapter of Rio's recent history, translating it into the city's instinctive language of dark comedy and collective catharsis. The Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars, who was visiting Brazil when the crimes were at their height in 1927, sought and obtained permission to interview Fabronio personally in the House of Detention. Cendrars wrote about the encounter in a series of articles published in the French newspaper Paris Soir, later compiled in his 1938 book La Vie d'Angerius. His account described the physical experience of being in the same room as Fabronio, the sensation it produced, the quality of the man's attention, the disorienting gap between the apparent normality of the person and the documented record of what that person had done. Films followed. In 1981, director José Set produced a feature film titled Fabronio Indio do Brasil. In 1984, the same year that Fabronio died, director Silvio Durin released a short documentary called The Prince of Fire, which went on to win the Best Editing Prize at the Festival de Gramado in 1985. In 2004, the popular Brazilian television program Linha Direta, broadcast on Rede Globo, dedicated an entire episode to the case, featuring actor Flavio Baracchi in the role of Fabronio and including commentary from Dr. Talvane Marins de Moraes, the psychiatrist who had accompanied him through his final years. The legal and academic worlds proved equally absorbed. The Fabronio case was recognized as a landmark not only in criminology but in the entire relationship between medicine and law in Brazil. The first Brazilian case in which medical science formally overrode the cold letter of criminal law, establishing for the first time in the country a meaningful legal distinction between a criminal and a person who is genuinely, clinically, incurably sick. Fabronio died on August 27, 1984, at the age of 89 years old. The cause of death was pulmonary emphysema. He had spent 57 years inside the walls of institutional confinement, longer than some of his victims had been alive at all. His body was buried on September 5, 1984, at the Caju Cemetery, the same cemetery from which, 57 years earlier, he had stolen a human head and brought it home to boil. Whether this geographical symmetry was intentional is not recorded. Whether anyone who made the decision was aware of the connection is not known. But it is the kind of detail that this case generates with unsettling regularity. The kind that makes you pause and wonder about the mechanisms by which history folds back on itself. What Fabronio Indio do Brasil left behind him when he died was not simply a criminal record or a list of victims. He left behind a precedent, a formal, legally established framework through which Brazil would thereafter handle the relationship between mental illness and criminal accountability. The Penal Code of 1940 incorporated the principles that his case had forced the system to articulate: that a person incapable of understanding the unlawful nature of their acts cannot be held to the same standard of punishment as one who acts with full comprehension; that dangerousness and moral culpability are not the same thing; that society has a legitimate interest in permanent protection from individuals whose condition makes them permanently dangerous, regardless of the absence of legal guilt in the traditional sense. He had been Brazil's first serial killer. He became, in his own wretched and catastrophic way, one of the architects of Brazilian criminal law. The children in 1930s Rio who were warned to behave themselves or Fabronio would come for them grew old. Their grandchildren grew old after them. The city they lived in was transformed beyond recognition. The wasteland at Praia das Flechiras where Jacob and Octavio were violated became the ground beneath an international airport. The forests of Ribeiro Island where Alamaro and Janjoca were strangled were built over and covered with the structures of an expanding metropolis. The Caju Cemetery where the stolen head originated and the body was eventually buried became just another neighborhood landmark. Life moved forward with the particular indifference that time maintains toward all human horror. But somewhere in the architecture of Brazilian law, in the language of psychiatric reports, in the institutional memory of the Heitor Cariu Judicial Asylum, the case of Fabronio Indio do Brazil never entirely closed. Could not. A man who called himself the Son of Light and spent 57 years locked behind walls while the country outside his window tried to understand what to do with someone like him. A man whose name could not be given to babies, whose crimes saturated newspapers and novels and films and carnival songs, whose face was shown to grieving fathers in police stations as proof of what the world could produce, does not close. He settles, slowly, into the bedrock of a nation's memory. He becomes the thing that was there before the safety measures existed. He becomes the reason the measures exist at all. His story does not end with comfort. It ends with an old man dying alone in an asylum, breathing his last in the city where he had painted himself yellow and danced around a bound child on a sacred mountain. It ends with a quiet burial in the same cemetery he had once desecrated. It ends without apology, without repentance, without any sign that the woman with the long blonde hair ever returned to him to explain that the mission had been a terrible mistake. He died the Son of Light, and the darkness he left behind has never fully lifted. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.